Welcome everyone to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. I'm very happy that we have Pascal Chevrier here with us today, who is going to be sharing some ideas, some insights that were gleaned from many years of research and thinking about some very important battles of history that have been largely suppressed, as so much of history is. I mean, as the old cliche goes, it's written by the winners in a sense, and that's often bandied about and abused and not thought about properly. But the fact remains that the most deep, profound lessons that would give us better insight into the problems of our current age, and thus better insight into how to create futures that are actually in harmony with natural law, have been suppressed for obvious reasons. Or at least, if not suppressed completely, then at least turned inside out with narratives about the causes of certain battles, certain effects in history reframed that would iron out or make obscure the truth of the nature of the drama. And history really is, when looked at properly, a real drama shaped, as Shakespeare had said, all the world's a stage and all of us are players. That is very true. And history itself, when you actually look at and appreciate the conspiratorial nature of human society as a phenomenon going back thousands of years, history is shaped by individuals with ideas who put in those thoughts into action, usually not by themselves, but usually organizing co-thinkers, AKA conspiracies. And those are not necessarily bad. Sometimes you have, and very oftentimes you have, very good conspiracies, AKA, again, to remind people, ideas and thoughts put into action to get effects based upon concepts that pertain to human nature, the nature of creation, the nature of natural law, which not everybody agrees on as being the same thing. We often use the same words, but we'll find different meanings, sometimes very, very different meanings associated with the definitions of those words that result in very different types of social processes: cultural, military, defense, economic. So the US experience is very special, very unique from the standpoint of this battle in universal history as something that didn't emerge in a vacuum. It didn't just come out of a bunch of people who didn't want to pay taxes or, didn't like British tea. There's a deeper continuity. And Pascal has done an immense amount of work. Has done an immense amount of work on a lot of this material. And we're going to focus today on something that I think is very important, which has, again, a lot of people see that the nation states, especially the nation states of the West, are experiencing the utilization of national power for very bad agendas. Now, and we hear things like, Green New Deal. We hear things that involves an invocation of certain policies that a lot of people have good feelings about, even in the subconscious, the New Deal of the 1930s that changed the trajectory from a eugenics-based dark age of economic collapse and depression of the Great Depression into a situation of hope, of productivity. So that is being invoked, but with a very different outcome and intention than the original New Deal. But it's really, again, this narrative reframing like we heard about last week with Dave's lesson. So we see things like that involve national power to direct credit. In Canada, they're talking about creating new Ukrainian bonds. So every Canadian can buy these bonds to help arm Ukrainians in some proxy war overseas, right? Again, these are all things that had once been used at different times in Canada, in the US history, for the sake of developing the real productive nature of our society. We saw this with Lincoln's greenbacks, and the 520 bonds of the Civil War, where citizens were encouraged to invest in bonds that were tied to the development of their society. That was a very different idea from these sorts of things, but they have similar forms. And so people are being led to believe, okay, thus nation states are the problem. Central power is thus only something that can destroy and enslave, can't do anything good with it. That is really a bad sleight of hand. And if we allow ourselves to think in those terms, we can't understand anything about the actual historic nature of the last several thousand years or how to get out of it. And the battle between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton is key in understanding where this real fight emerged and what are the terms and conditions of this. So without further ado, I won't say anything more. I'll let it I'll give the baton over to Pascal to carry out his idea, and we're going to have a robust conversation. If anybody, like usual, has a question, please put your name in the chat box, and like usual, we'll call upon you in queue. Pascal, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. All right, I'm gonna just share my screen to make sure that everybody
enables us to make a circle.
Hold on, let me just fix that here. Okay, I'm having some trouble with the mute. There we go. Yeah, so that should not happen again. Okay, Pascal, try it again.
Very good. Okay, so hopefully you can see the PowerPoint, which I have not started yet, which should start now. Okay.
Perfect. Yes.
All right. So yeah, as Matthew has stated previously, we're going to look at the foundation of the United States today. It's going to be a presentation, I hope, which will inspire you people to look into it a bit more, because really there's a lot of material I could have put in this presentation. I tried to keep it in a simple form. We're going to look at different quotes from especially Jefferson, actually, but also we're going to talk about Hamilton and what he tried to do. I guess that everybody, or most people, actually know, even if you're not from the United States, you might have heard of this opposition, and it's a very central one in the history of the United States. It comes back again and again and again, and that's why I thought it would be an interesting thing to look at today. So what was America's founding mission? Was it Hamilton or was it Jefferson? I just decided to put another picture of Jefferson right there, where you see Jefferson holding the Declaration of Independence, and he's portrayed as the Renaissance man of the the starting of the American historical epoch, if you will. So let's dig into this, or dive. I have a first quote here. It says, about 70 years ago, two great political parties were first formed in this country. That Thomas Jefferson was the head of one of them, and I don't know if people want to think about who could be the head of the other one. And Boston, whoops, it moved a little bit upward. Boston, the headquarters of the other. So obviously, I wanted to trick you by putting this quote up, and but it's a real paradox, and this comes from Abraham Lincoln. So in a letter that he wrote to Henry L. Pierce in 1859, he stated that there were two parties at the beginning of the United States, one headed by Jefferson and the other one by Boston. So this is kind of intriguing, since we just discussed that the opposition is between Jefferson and Hamilton. Why would Abraham Lincoln, who verily was a follower of the policies of Alexander Hamilton, why would he state that actually it was Boston, which was the head of the second party? So I put you just a little chart here, just to bring back probably things that you've seen before, but in adding on the Federalist side, because the two parties which were generated by the construction of the United States Federation was the Federalist Party and the opposition, the Anti-Federalist Party, which became known as the Democratic Republicans, headed by Jefferson. And on the other side, you can see on the Federalist side, Hamilton, but I added Boston since Abraham Lincoln stated it. And the original ideas, which are basically like what you would get in high school when you study this in the United States. So the idea that the Federalists were for a strong federal government, a strong union, and then the Democratic Republicans were for decentralized states, so like a confederation. And obviously the question of the national bank, which we're going to get back to soon in this presentation. So on one side, the Federalists were for national bank, and you can think that actually the idea of the Boston side of it is actually that old kind of British or Anglophile portion, because the Democratic Republicans were also known as being a bit more on the side of the French, especially the French Revolution, Jacobin type, as Jefferson was actually denounced for being sympathetic to. And so on the Federalist side, they were said to be a bit more on the British side. And the national bank was obviously the idea of Hamilton. On the other side, Jefferson didn't really like the banks, and that was part of the big debate, which occurred at the beginning in the first cabinet of George Washington. So people might have different views of Alexander Hamilton and where he belongs in all of this. And it's not very easy right now to understand really the character. There's different attempts, good and not so good. And so we're not going to talk about the musical today. That was not my idea. But that might be how some of the people here have heard about Hamilton for the first time. We're going to talk about Wall Street, and we're going to talk about Main Street in a sense. These are, the two sides, one being like the money power, and the other one, the main population, just, John Q, American people. So we're going to look a bit into this. Where does Hamilton belongs in all of this? For the older folks, I decided I would put maybe another slide, which humored me too when I watched it. But there's the Jack Benny program, which had done in 1962, an episode on Hamilton, actually, on Jack Benny becoming Alexander Hamilton, and how, in a sense, you could see what people in the 1960s United States were thinking Hamilton represented. And obviously it's a joke, but it kind of gives you an idea that the American population does not necessarily know that well their founders, or have very, very stereotypical ideas of what they are. Like you can see on the top left hand side, the character Don Wilson plays Benjamin Franklin. So obviously the light bulb, electricity, the kite, and the key. So that's a common image that people have of Ben Franklin. And you have Dennis Day as Aaron Burr, and obviously the duel which occurred. The American people now see Hamilton on their $10 bills. That's where the American people might know Hamilton from at the very beginning of their lives. That's where they see it for the first time, I guess. So that's where he is. But to my understanding is, and his character, his person, but also his policies were much more than just to be on the $10 bills. But that's what it is today. So we were discussing, where did the American War of Independence come from? Matthew has stated that, was it a question of taxation? Was it really just because they didn't want to give their money to the British king? They were fed up with all of this. Well, the slogan, the motto, "No taxation without representation," is still very common to see. It's on the Washington D.C. Car plates. So if you go there, that's what you'll see on every car, or most of them. And this is pretty typical too, to portray the American Revolution as being more of a economic or bourgeois kind of revolution, where basically they replaced an elite with another one, which was just not the British, but the Native Americans, not native in terms of the native people, but American people instead of British people. So I have this quote from John Adams, actually, who says that, "I have always laughed at the affectation of representing American independence as a novel idea, as a modern discovery, as a late invention. The idea of it as a possible thing, as a probable event, nay, as a necessary and unavoidable measure, in case Great Britain should assume an unconstitutional authority over us, has been familiar to Americans from the first settlement of the country, and was as well understood by Governor Winthrop as by Governor Samuel Adams." So it was not a new idea when the Americans took up arms, but it took a long time, a long process to get there. But this was not just the question of taxation, or just for the mere pleasure of doing it. It was really a long process of development, which today I'm not going to go into so much, but I'm going to give you some ideas of where you can find good material to study it at the end of this presentation. Let's carry on. So obviously, you always have things like we say in French, the drop that made the whole vase spill over. So you have things that were done by the British, which ultimately brought about the conflict to heat up, for sure. That's we can understand. But the previous quote by John Adams showed us that it was not just a spontaneous thing. It was really a long process to come to the Declaration of Independence and the war against Great Britain. So you have, I wanted to mention, for the sake of it, the intolerable acts of 1774, which could be you could say the drop which spilled the whole pot. So the Boston Port Act was in response to the Boston Tea Party, as mentioned by Matthew previously. So the Bostonians threw the tea of the British East India Company in the port, in the water, and so the British reacted by putting up voting in the Boston Port Act, and it closed the whole harbor. The port of Boston was closed until it was decided that they would pay back for the merchandise, the tea which was spilled, and the king was satisfied until the king would be satisfied. After that, you had the Massachusetts Government Act, which also was even worse because it withdrew the old constitution, or the act, the charter, which constituted the Massachusetts Bay Colony at the beginning, and brought it under the control of the British government. So anything could be done now by the governors or the representative of the king it was destroying basically the constitution of the colony. Then the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed the royal governor to order trials of accused royal officials to take place in Great Britain or elsewhere. So basically could get away if they had any kind of problem in the colonies. They could be tried elsewhere in the empire. The Quartering Act applied to all British colonies in North America for housing British troops. So that was also part of the Intolerable Acts. And the Quebec Act, which I added there, was also in 1774, which was blocking the development of the Western expansion for the 13 colonies by giving the province of Quebec all of the area, the lands around the Great Lakes, very far inside the continent, and blocking the development of the other 13 colonies, and also basically giving back the rights to French Canadians speak French and also practice the religion, Catholicism, which was not seen really as a good thing in the American colonies. But the British probably knew something was going on. So 2 years after, you have the Declaration of Independence, as you know, July 4th, 1776. And so here's a painting of what it might have looked like when the Declaration of Independence was submitted to the Continental Congress. The tall guy is said to be Jefferson in the middle, submitting the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson is known to this day as being the one who authored, who was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. We're going to look into this. So Jefferson it is true that he was the one who wrote, because John Adams suggested him to the committee. There was a drafting committee which was formed of several people. Ben Franklin was on it, John Adams was on it, Jefferson. And so the first draft, it is true, was written by Jefferson, but it was also amended. Many things were changed. Whole paragraphs were thrown out or rewritten totally. So there were more than, I think, 40 alterations to the first draft. So to say that it was really Jefferson who wrote it is letting a lot out of the whole organization of how the Continental Congress really worked and who really was part of these decisions. Jefferson later in his life regarded the Declaration, the inspiration that he mentioned for how he wrote it at the beginning was really the looking at John Locke and the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, so-called. And so this might give you an idea. Maybe you know them, maybe you don't. But John Locke was more or better known as the one who actually wrote the Constitution for South Carolina, which was basically a slave state. And that's how it was created. The charter and the Constitution were formatted in that way. And John Locke was the author of the Constitution, the charter for South Carolina. So that gives you maybe a better idea of where Jefferson came from. But we're going to continue looking into this. So the drafting committee, there you go. I gave you the names right there, and that's it. 47 alterations were made late after Jefferson wrote the first draft. Obviously, the most well-known part of the Declaration of Independence is the beginning, where it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is very interesting because, and that's where you can actually see that there's a difference in concept and ideas from the Jefferson side and from the alteration side, the people decided to make the change. Because if Jefferson was really inspired by John Locke, well, John Locke was the one who wrote that it was life, liberty, and property, which were the fundamental rights, basically, of man. And so in the Declaration of Independence, what you see is that it's not property, but it's the pursuit of happiness. And so that's a very different concept. That's a very different idea. So you had the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to go into the War of Independence. There's a lot of things which could be said, but it could be also a whole presentation or 2 or 3 or a semester of presentation. So we're not going to do that right now. I just wanted to give you an idea of who was in the first cabinet of President George Washington. So here you have the grid showing you. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. I just have these that I want to hide. Oh, there you go. Okay. Okay. So here it is. You have the cabinet. So it was actually a fairly small cabinet at the time. It was the beginning of it. And you have so on the picture on the drawing on the left, you have the main proponent, the Thomas Jefferson, Hendrick Knox, John Adams, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton. Okay, that's a big question too today. The American people hear a lot about this idea that the United States is a democracy. And so that's interesting because at the beginning, whether it was on the Jeffersonian side or on the Hamilton side, the United States was not seen as a democracy. That was not the main idea. Certainly the party was called the Democratic Republican Party on the side of Jefferson, what will become eventually the Democratic Party. So this was an idea which was there, but the United States was not created as a pure democracy. It was really created as a modern nation state, a Republican type of government. And less offices were actually submitted to elections at the time. The Senate was not elected. It took until the 1910s, I believe, around 1913, when the Senate actually became an elective institution. So the United States was not a democracy from the start. It had democratic parts, institutions as a Congress, but the idea of a republic and a democracy are not necessarily synonymous. It's not the same thing. And the founders had studied history really thoroughly to understand what had gone wrong back in the days of the Athenian democracy and also the Roman Republic, what had been going wrong or good, also to see what were the good aspect of them and also the wrong turns that it could take. And so they were very careful because they didn't just think that just letting people vote, everybody would just solve the problem instead of having a king and the British hereditary system. So it was a big debate at the beginning, and but just to make sure to everybody right now, the United States was never designed to be just a pure democracy. That's just name throwing. The United States is not a pure democracy. So who was Alexander Hamilton? We're going to look a little bit at Alexander Hamilton right now. I have put up this just to give you an idea. So he was not born in the United States, actually. He was born in the West Indies. And he was seen as an illegitimate son because his mother had not divorced from her first husband. So it always kind of hung over Hamilton's head that he might have been, well, he was an illegitimate son, or that he was not conceived under the bound of marriage. So that was an insult which was thrown at him many times. He was fairly young, but he was able to actually go and study. He was seen as a very intelligent kid, and he was teaching himself a lot on his own, having access with good priests, which were teaching in the island of Nevis. He had access to a lot of great books, studied the Greeks and Romans. And by the age of 17, he was able to raise funds from France and charities around the island to be able to actually fund his trip to go stay in the United States in New York and study at the New York College. So that was in 1772. He became, most people might have known him or heard about the fact that he was the aide-de-camp to General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. He's known as being a banker, so it's true. He founded the Bank of New York in 1784. He was also, really, you could say that Hamilton is the father of the US Constitution, because he was the one who really fought the most to get it ratified. So the first Constitution of the United States is known as the Article of Confederation, and that was just right after the American Revolution had been won. But this system was too lax, was too weak to really do anything to benefit this new country. They were really on the verge of actually being reabsorbed by the British Empire if they had continued on that way. So Hamilton really fought for many years. So it says from 1785 through 1788, Hamilton was writing to get a federal union, a stronger federal government for the United States. And so the Constitution, which the United States have to this day, was really at the instigation of Hamilton. He really fought for it. He's not necessarily the one who wrote it, but he was on the Committee of Styles, which basically formulated the Constitution. So he was not alone into this, but he wrote 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers, which were basically the propaganda, you could say, for the Constitution. So these were written and publicized in the newspaper at the time, and people could read them. There were a lot of different public readings of these papers, and so that's where the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist came from. Really was from the proponents and the opponents of the new Constitution. And so Hamilton was really the spearhead of the movement for the Constitution. Meanwhile, at the same time, he was doing in 1785, he was creating with John Jay the New York Manumission Society, and it was to abolish slavery, especially starting in the state of New York, but eventually doing it for the whole Union, for the whole country. He's most well known to be the first U.S. Treasury Secretary under George Washington. He stayed in post until 1795, so from 1789 to 1795. And also known for the duel he had with Aaron Burr in 1804, which he died from. So that's very short and sweet, hopefully, a short idea of who Hamilton was. Most of these things are kind of commonly known. So let's look at the ideas that Hamilton was promoting. I'm not going to talk so much about the Constitution, but really more about the economic ideas of Hamilton, because really it gives you an idea of a good sense of what was Hamilton's conception of mankind and of the really how the development of each individual could be promoted with the new institutions which were created. So that links back to the Constitution, but we're going to look more about the economic ideas. And also, I'm not going to go so much in details because with the RTF, we have done a series of readings of the one of the report that Hamilton wrote to the U.S. Congress in the first cabinet of Washington. He wrote different reports, which are cited on this slide here, and the one we read was the one on manufacturers. So if people want to know more of the details of these reports, well, we have the reading on the subject of manufacturers, which will last you a couple hours. So if people are interested, I highly suggest that you go check this out. But so the American system of political economy, or the American system for short, is really linked to Hamilton, like this idea of a strong government, but also of real banking financial institutions there to promote commerce and development. But it's more than banks and it's more than money. It's really the idea of how to put a nation to work and make it really independent. Because you could say, the Declaration of Independence was one thing, was to say that you were independent, but it's one thing to say it, it's another to be it. Because if you don't have the institutions to make sure that you preserve that independence, then what was the whole revolution for? What was the fight for? It ended up just being for nothing. So Hamilton understood this, and he really fought at the beginning, basically with the American population, but with Jefferson obviously as being the representative of the opposition. He fought for these conception of how the United States should be organized to really become a major powerhouse, a major economic powerhouse, and transform not just America, but the whole world. So I stated the different reports. So you have the public credit, the national bank, or which is also known as the second report on public credit, on the establishment of a mint, and on the subject of manufacturers. So Hamilton was writing reports all throughout 1790 and 1791 and presenting them to the US Congress for adoption. All of them, except the one on manufacturers, were adopted. So he was able to get a national bank and get the government to issue public credit for development. And so we could say the idea that Hamilton had was that a nation geared towards promoting the general welfare, as is stated in the preamble of the US Constitution, so the general welfare of its inhabitants, will strive to give the necessary means to develop everyone's potential. So the national bank that Hamilton created was for him necessary. It was a necessary mean to achieve a goal. It was not a goal in itself. Jefferson disagreed, and Washington agreed. So in the end, the president actually went on the side of Hamilton. Even though the manufacturer's report was not adopted by the Congress, these ideas were so powerful, and the way Hamilton had been able to promote them and continue to promote them afterwards made it in the sense that these policies were implemented, were put in, even though the whole report was not voted favorably by the U.S. Congress. So that's also one thing, an interesting fact, is that these ideas were so powerful and needed in the newly formed country that they had to implement them, whether it was voted for by the Congress for this report or not. On the other side, at the time, was the promotion, the British Empire was promoting the idea of free trade. And so what I wrote here was that basically the British free trade of the late 18th century was an imperial policy crafted to preserve superiority and deny others independence. So for the British Empire, it was a very good policy, and it stopped other nations from developing and kept the superiority in terms of development or the technological improvements that had been going on in the British Isle at the time. It was keeping them for the empire, and all of the rest of the world and the colonies would just be basically raw material providers to the empire, which would transform them and then resell them all around the world. I've put some agents of influence, the ones who wrote different treatises on the economics which promoted the empire. So obviously you have Adam Smith, who wrote his Wealth of Nations in 1776. David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, Jeremy Bentham, and you have more, obviously, but these are some of the main proponents of the imperial British economics, you could say. There might be an opposition on certain things, but they were really working for the empire all throughout. So really, is it really a big difference? Not to me. So you could say that the world at the time, when the Americans declared independence, was really run by different monopolies, or are organized under an oligarchy. And the way that it worked was that might made right. So the stronger took all. And the British East India Company is basically like their preferred model of enterprise, going around and basically ruling all of the different colonies, having their private army, and just dictating the laws for the different parts of the world at the time, and obviously bringing back the profits. Comparative advantages, that's also another idea which came up a bit much more with Ricardo, but was already there at the beginning with Adam Smith. So the idea that basically if you were good at one thing, well, that's what you had to do, and that's how you would prosper, because why trying to do what the other is already doing? Just keep on doing what you're good at, and that's going to be good for everybody. Except obviously you could understand that it's not going to develop you anything more in terms of industries It's going to keep you confined to one thing. And that's exactly what the British Empire wanted, was to divide and conquer. And so the idea was to really keep the colonies down and not letting them become independent in any way. So the roles were defined. You either were in a metropolis and you were ruling the whole system, or you were a colony and you were limited, not just in terms of industry, but also in terms of your ability to reproduce. The population was also kind of maintained to the lowest level possible by these policies. It was not just by wars and all that, or genocide, but it was really by an economic policy to make sure that people would stay low and not be able to develop. So the colonies would just be producers of raw materials. And that's what was clear for the United States at the beginning. In the Declaration of Independence, they also stated that that was a policy, that the king, being the representative of the British Empire, had stopped them from developing their industries. And so that was a major point that brought up the War of Independence. So here's a quote from Hamilton. I said we're not going to go too much in detail, but I think that's the best quote to give you an idea of how he was thinking about it, because he wrote this, the report on the subject of manufactures was really an attack on the physiocrats school of economics, mainly the ones in France at the time, but also an attack on Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nation, and on the British imperial economics. So Hamilton's idea of manufacture, why he's pushing so much to get manufacturers in the United States, industries, he says, is because to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Even things in themselves not positively advantageous sometimes become so by their tendency to provoke exertion. Every new scene which is open to the busy nature of man to rouse and exert itself is the addition of a new energy to the general stock of effort. The spirit of enterprise, useful and prolific as it is, must necessarily be contracted or expended in proportion to the simplicity or variety of the occupations and productions which are to be found in a society. It must be less in a nation of mere cultivators than in a nation of cultivators and merchants. Less in a nation of cultivators and merchants than in a nation of cultivators, artificers, and merchants. So you see that it's pretty clear. He's saying that the wealth of nations will come from the more activities you have in that very nation. So the more you occupy people at different tasks, at solving different problems, at becoming better, this will actually create wealth for the whole. This is how you actually do it. So let's keep that in mind as we're looking into Thomas Jefferson now. So Thomas Jefferson was older than Hamilton. Hamilton was very young at the beginning of the Revolution. So these images, obviously, there's in the center, you have the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., with the statue on the right, which is inside the memorial. And on the left, on the very left, I thought was a very interesting sketch, a very interesting drawing of Jefferson, because you see that he's looking at us And who's looking at Jefferson? Well, you have Ben Franklin. It's a bust of Ben Franklin. And I think Jefferson is a very intriguing character because he certainly said interesting things. I have a book here of sayings, different ideas, contemplations by Jefferson on different subjects: liberty, freedom, and piety, religion, all that. So he certainly wrote on many, many subjects, and he knew a great deal. He was fluent in Latin, in Greek, in German, in French, I believe Italian also. So he knew different languages. He had read, he had a good amount of classical education behind him. But you could say that he was surrounded. He was badly surrounded. He didn't make good friends, or his friends were not good inspiration for him, or good. I'm missing the word right now. But basically, he was kind of swayed by his acquaintances, and he did not necessarily have the best idea of who were the good guys or the good friends. So the Ben Franklin bust right there, it reminded me a lot about the Rembrandt painting, where you have, as Jerry Terrien has told us in a different presentation, that the idea of the Rembrandt painting is not necessarily Aristotle and Homer, but much more Virgil and Homer. I thought that this was very significant because that's exactly the paradox, is that Jefferson really seemed to have some great ideas at the beginning when he was younger. He was inspired to do the right thing for the United States, for the colonies at the time. But as we're going to see, he was actually influenced by the other side, and he did not stay in touch with the American revolutionary spirit, we could say, represented in that drawing by the bust of Benjamin Franklin. Let's look into this. This is just a timeline, very plain, just what you can see online about the life of Jefferson. So that's what people usually see him as. So you see 1776, he's the one who writes the Declaration of Independence. There you go. Then he's going to be ambassador of the United States to France in 1785 to 89, and he becomes the Secretary of State under George Washington in 1789, and then in 1800 he becomes the President of the United States, and for 2 terms. So that's the main gist of what people know about Jefferson in a sense. As I told you, I have a book with many quotes, and this is maybe one of the most interesting I find by Jefferson, where he says that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. I think that we can pretty much all agree with that statement. I think it's something to be reminded of all the time, but we could put a lot of other nice quotes, but then you have to wonder about the actions which go with these words, and that's where I find that Thomas Jefferson falls short from these nice words. So as I said, he was known as the, he's still known as the author of the Declaration of Independence, different other texts like the Virginia Statute for establishing religious freedom. All right. So very liberal in that sense. Founder of the University of Virginia, and he was also governor of Virginia and the third president of the United States. So these are just factoids that people know. He's also known as being the sage of Monticello. Monticello was his big estate, his plantation, and that's just to give you the original quote. Mr. Jefferson, the great apostle of human rights, has told us that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And that was from the Richmond Inquirer. So, all right, these are great quotes. That's good. But what did Jefferson really want? On the other side, we saw that Hamilton wanted to develop the industries of the country, get people working on many things and develop their mind. Jefferson had this idea of a republic of the landholders. So he writes in his book, that's the book that he wrote, Notes on the State of Virginia. He writes, dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the design of ambition. So the idea was that if you were dependent upon others for your food, so if you're not a farmer or landholder, then you're dependent upon others to provide for you, basically. And so that's not good, as he states there, that it suffocates the germ of virtue. That's what he believes. That's what Jefferson believed. It's good to know that in 1790, that was the first census of the United States. And if you look at the population, what were the demographics? Well, 95% of the American people were farmers at the time. And I put the note at the bottom. It took until the 1910s for the US rural population to actually be in minority, to shift. So the 50% urban population was in the 1910s, after the census of 1910s. So that it took a long time for the urban population to get on top of the rural one. So at the time of Jefferson, it was not really such a big issue, because 95% of the American people were living on a farm. But he saw that the development of cities, big cities, as an issue for the American Republic. So Jefferson was from Virginia, and has, as I was saying before, but I don't think it's just a matter of being in Virginia, but really the acquaintances that you make and the friends that you keep, because George Washington was also from Virginia, a proud representative of that state. And so, but he wasn't, the character were different. So the Virginians were fast for declaring independence, but not as much to form the Union. So they were for independence, but when came the time for going for the Constitution, the new Constitution, they would rather stay with the Confederation. So I put you some quotes here from Patrick Henry's. He was a Virginian too. He was known for his speech where he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And where he was bringing up the idea of whether the king, asking the question whether the king was the father of his people or a tyrant, for which he was attacked at the time. by the authority for sure. And that was in response to the Stamp Act, which was another intolerable act, but I didn't mention it before, but that's also something interesting to look into. So although he publicly apologized, although he made the statement about give me liberty or death, he later on apologized to the king, publicly apologized, and vowed that he would shed the last drop of his blood in defense of the king. So that's a bit strange. It's a bit, that was in 1765, the Stamp Act. So they had, again, the Virginians had hot blood, but in the end, I guess it was not the time, or it was not exactly what they were for. It was not exactly independence at the time. They would not go that far. And he would retract himself. So he was a big influence on Jefferson. Jefferson was there at the House of Burgesses, which was the upper house of the state of Virginia in 1765 when the Stamp Act happened. It was voted by the British Parliament. There were debates. Patrick Henry gave that speech where he said, give me liberty or give me death. And that really inspired Jefferson, who was a young lawyer at the time, or was studying to become a lawyer at the time. There's the Lees, sorry. I went back. That was not the idea. Okay, sorry about that. The Lee family. So the Lees, there were many of them. Robert Henry and Arthur being the most important one, but they also had 4 other brothers. They were aristocrats. It was really the aristocracy, the land aristocracy of Virginia was very powerful at the time, but that family, the Lees, could actually trace themselves to be aristocrats since the 12th century England. They are also, it's probably you've seen that name Lee before, so they are the ancestor of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And Arthur Lee knew intimately Lord Shelburne, who we're going to talk about in the next slide also, who was a British Prime Minister at the time of the American Constitution. Arthur Lee also asked, he was sent to, he was part of the a delegation of Americans in Paris, and he asked for Ben Franklin to be recalled from Paris, with the different attacking him, attacking the faction of Ben Franklin at the time, who were close to the Republicans of France, Marquis de Lafayette and others, and were working to actually get an American Revolution type in France. We're trying to create really a good bond between the newly formed United States and the French France, the country. So in the end, actually, it's Arthur Lee who was recalled. Ben Franklin had to leave France, had to leave Paris, but it was because he was sick. And the one who replaced him was Thomas Jefferson, who became very well acquainted with the circles around Lord Shelburne. So the Shelburne crew, Shelburne was a British Prime Minister in the beginning of the 1780s, but he was also part of the broader institution, the intelligence circles of the British Empire, and was leading basically the charge at the time to make sure that France would not become like the United States in Europe, that the French Revolution would actually be derailed. And so he employed different agents, obviously British intelligence, but also people from Geneva. So Genevan agents were there in France and in the United States to try to derail the newly formed republics. Most well known is Jeremy Bentham, who was a chief propagandist for the empire. He was writing speeches during the French Terror, and getting his papers, his text to be translated in French by agents on the ground. Albert Gallatin was also from Geneva. He became the Secretary of Treasury under Thomas Jefferson when Jefferson was president. And Aaron Burr also was part of these circles. So I give you a bit more names on the right-hand side. In France, so you had different agitators or different people which were coordinated, not necessarily on the same in the same parties, same factions. They were some of them were opponents, but they were triggered, in a sense, organized by different agents from Shelburne. You had obviously the physiocrats. We're going to talk about economy on the side of Jefferson pretty soon. So you had Quesnay, you had Jean-Baptiste Say, Turgot, I could have mentioned too, who were the physiocratic school of economics. I guess not, well, probably more, you could say, accountants than economists, because when you compare the American system of Hamilton with what was going on at the time in Europe, it's really two different worlds, and it's two different intentions. So the physiocrats were known to create all of these tables to try to account for everything that existed in the society and see where people were employed. But in terms of generating something new, that was not really the idea. It was just to have a static understanding of what was going on at the time. So like just to take a picture and have an accounting, like all of these accounting files ready. So Jefferson, as I mentioned before, was in France from 1785 to 89. He spoke French. He was taught when he was young, and he was acquainted with these circles. He became very close to these different circles and was following the mob as the French Revolution was actually derailed. In 1804, I thought that was interesting. Jean-Baptiste Say, so one of the physiocrats, sent Jefferson his book, and Jefferson praised it for leading him to, quote, to the perusal of Malthus's work on population, a work of sound logic in which some of the opinions of Adam Smith, as well as of the economists, are ably examined. So maybe people don't know Malthus. Thomas Malthus was also part of the crew that I mentioned before for the imperial economics of the British Empire. He had this notion that basically cities were overpopulated. This idea of overpopulation today is really not new. Malthus was talking about it at the time back in the 1790s. And so this was an idea which was circulating in the different circles, in the different imperial circles. And Jefferson was acquainted with that by receiving the book by Jean-Baptiste Say in 1804, as he was the president of the United States. And as you can see, he was very pleased. He was sympathetic to Malthus's idea of overpopulation, and also with Adam Smith, Wealth of Nation. Jefferson, again, on the different waves of yellow fever, which occurred in the United States, especially in the cities. So between 1793 and 1800, there were different waves in Philadelphia, in New York City, for example. So a lot of people died at the time from the flu, the yellow fever. And Jefferson wrote on that. He said, "When great evils happen, I am in the habit of looking out for what good may arise from them as consolations to us. And Providence has in fact so established the order of things as that most evils are the means of producing some good." Okay, well, that's not necessarily evil. It's okay, that's how philosophically you would look at the situation. Maybe some better, some good might come out of this evil. That's interesting. But he continues, even if the pestilence was a scourge, it was beneficial for by discouraging the growth of great cities in our nation. And I view great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. So for him, actually, maybe some good would, the good that would probably come out of this is that people would leave the cities and go settle themselves in the land, become farmers or whatnot. That's the idea that I brought up of the Republic of Landholders before. And so that was a good side of the epidemics at the time for Jefferson. He didn't really mind so much the yellow fever, because it was, to him, the great danger was the building of cities and industries, which was going on. He also, on the subject of rebellions, Jefferson said, "No country can preserve its liberties if the rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance when those liberties are threatened. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." So, interesting too, how Jefferson thought that basically you needed to have these kind of conflicts. It can be said that it's true that nowadays there's a huge disconnection between the population and the governments. Now, is a civil war or a bloodbath really the answer? Is it really how this has to be solved? Well, it seemed that for Jefferson, this was the lesser evil. The lesser, it was actually good to get some blood spilled on both sides, on the patriot side and on the tyrant side, once in a while, just to keep people in check. Just want to make sure liberties are preserved. But I'm not sure that's actually the way it should be dealt with, and I'm not sure that the results are actually that the liberties will be preserved when these things happen. So that's also interesting to see how Jefferson was thinking about that. Okay, now let's get into the economics. We've seen what Hamilton was doing for the economics. Now, Jefferson. So in 1781, in his book, The Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson lays it pretty clearly. He says, "In Europe, the lands are either cultivated or locked up against the cultivator. Manufacture must therefore be resorted to of necessity, not of choice, to support the surplus of their people. But we have an immensity of land, courting the industry of the husbandman. It is best, then, that all our citizens should be employed in its improvement, or that one half should be called off from that to exercise manufactures and handicraft arts for the other. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. While we have land to labor, then, let us never wish to see our citizens occupied at a workbench or twirling a distaff. Carpenters, masons, smiths are wanting in husbandry. But for the general operations of manufactures, let our workshops remain in Europe. So that's pretty significant. That's the idea that Jefferson had of how the United States would develop as a land, as I said, of landholders or farmers. And basically every production would be done in the workshops in Europe. That's how you wanted it to be. But there's more. Were I to indulge my own theory, I should wish them, the Americans, to practice neither commerce nor navigation, but to stand with respect to Europe, precisely on the footing of China. We should thus avoid wars, and all our citizens would be husbandmen. So he even was going further. If you were to ask him, he was even going further. He was really against the idea that the United States would have commerce with the world. That was not his idea. His idea was really to just develop the land where you're at, and if other people want to bring you stuff, then that's fine. And Jefferson, at the end of his second term, also had an act which was barring the commerce with England. And there's I have the caricature here, which was used at the time. You could see it's at the time Napoleon was in power in France. So he was basically promoting an act. I think I have what was it called? The Embargo Act of 1808. At the end of Jefferson's second term, he was. I don't have my notes right now. I'm sorry. But he was basically, you see that people were angry at this. People were working in the different industries, navigation and all that. This is what the cartoon represents. So basically, Jefferson was seen as anti-British, so he really didn't care so much if commerce was lost with England at the time. And gonna stick to that for now. Sorry.
Just quick, Pascal.
Yes.
From 2 slides ago, just quick, the point that he makes on also China, and this is the only time I'm going to chime in, but it was just too much.
Okay.
When he said like we should model ourselves on the agrarian China that also doesn't have industry, and just look at how peaceful they are, that they've avoided all wars. He's writing this in 1781, of course, but then just look at what happened in the 19th century with the Opium Wars and the total destruction of China, which would have been the model used for the United States. You could only imagine like that would have happened exactly the same way to the United States by the British if they had followed his prescriptions. So that was just an irony that I love.
Good point. Yes. I didn't want to go too much in the future, but it's true. It's a good point to make. Exactly. Yeah. And so philosophically speaking, we've seen Jefferson on different aspects on the economics, but what about the philosophical ideas? How he viewed Plato, for example. I found this letter that he wrote to John Adams in 1814, where he said, back from a trip to his second home, his farmhouse, I think, he said, I amused myself with reading seriously Plato's Republic. I am wrong, however, in calling it amusement, for it was the heaviest task work I ever went through. Okay, all right. I had occasionally before taken up some of his other works, but scarcely ever had patience to go through a whole dialogue. While wading through the whimsies, the puerilities, and unintelligible jargon of this work, I laid it down, often to ask myself how it could have been that the world should have so long consented to give reputation to such nonsense as this. It is fortunate for us that Platonic republicanism does not obtain the same favor as Platonic Christianity, or we should not now have been all living, men, women, and children, pell-mell together, like the beasts of the field or forest. Now that's very interesting, because I think that Jefferson didn't really read the whole Republic from what he says. Maybe he read the first 3-4 books, but he actually missed the reversal in the writing of Plato. And this, you can read the whole letter if you want. It's fairly easy to find online. He says more about it and Socrates and Plato. But I think that gave you the gist of how he was looking at it. So the idea of a republic for Jefferson was not coming from Plato. It was coming from somewhere else. And it's very interesting to see that actually he didn't like reading Plato. He didn't appreciate the work, and he found, weird that civilization, the Western civilization, would have revered Plato's writings and the teachings of Plato. And I think that gives you an idea of why probably Jefferson kept his slaves all his life, because even though he said in different places that slavery was a bad thing, he still had slaves and kept them. And I think that maybe if he had read Plato's Meno, he would have come to a different idea, or would have been shocked by it, certainly. For those who don't know, basically in the Meno, Socrates is discussing virtue with Meno, and eventually he's going to get a slave of Meno to make a discovery. And that's a very important, I think, dialogue by Plato, and obviously one that Jefferson didn't read or didn't take seriously. And yeah, I was talking about slavery, so just to compare both, now we're kind of done with all of the different quotes on one side or the other. But for Alexander Hamilton, I had mentioned previously that he was part of the Society for Manumission in New York State with John Jay. He never had slave, was part of the abolition movement with Benjamin Franklin. Following Hamilton's lead, New York State enacted gradual emancipation of slaves in 1799. On the other side, Thomas Jefferson, even though you could say, well, by the conditions he was born in, he had slaves. Well, we can't blame that on him. So he was born in a slave-holding family. And he had overall 600 slaves during his lifetime. At any given time, there were around 130 slaves at his estate of Monticello. And Jefferson wrote that maintaining slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. So Jefferson was really stuck in a hard place, as we say. And even though he knew slavery was bad, and he was known for also having children with one of his slave, I believe Sally. That's another interesting paradox, because if you were not going to let your slave become free, then even the child he had with Sally, with his slave, would become a slave. So
Pascal.
Yeah, sorry.
Actually, it was his brother Randolph who had that relationship. A political enemy of Thomas Jefferson said about that. It was
Shannon, your voice is you're not talking into the microphone very consistently.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear me better now?
It's much better.
Much better. Actually, an enemy of Thomas Jefferson's put that about him and Sally. It was actually his brother Randolph who had the children with Sally. And then Thomas Jefferson bought the whole family because they were going to be split up. He bought her kids so that they could stay together.
Okay.
So that was his brother Randolph. But still, I mean, the contradictions, that still stands. He was a slave owner.
Yeah, for sure.
I definitely,
sure if that anime is actually correct, but
yes.
It still holds that, he was kind of known for that, for going around and messing around with the slave. For him, it was clear. He stated it that for the white Americans and enslaved blacks constituted two separate nations who could not live together peacefully in the same country. So he was actually for the idea of sending back slaves to other parts, or creating something for them. But really, for him, there was no freeing of the slaves possible under his watch, at least. It had to be like a very, very long process, which obviously Alexander Hamilton was completely opposed to and was fighting against, for real freeing of the slaves, and fast. Okay, so we've talked about Hamilton and Jefferson, and so we see that there's different problems that were faced at the time of the newly formed republic. The real big problem was also that Jefferson was badly surrounded, as I said, and but he was not necessarily the worst one. So there were attempts, many attempts, at destroying the United States from without, but also from within. And so we're gonna really quickly go over this. There is work. I talked to Matthew just before the presentation, and he reminded me that actually Jerry Terrien has written a good amount on this, and Matthew also has been writing on the subject. So if people want to know more, we'll put links to this presentation so that you can go and look it up for yourself, what Matthew and Jerry have written on this question of the attempt to create secession. I called it the plots of 1800, 1803, and 1807. So it comes in the character of Aaron Burr, which I mentioned, a little bit previously. And so Burr was really much more of a British imperial agent, much more on that side than Jefferson could have been. So for Burr, it was conscious. It was a real conscious effort. Here's an interesting quote from Anthony Merry, the British U.S. ambassador. He says in 1804, "I have just received an offer from Mr. Burr, the actual Vice President of the United States, to lend his assistance to His Majesty's government in any matter in which they may think fit to employ him, particularly endeavoring to effect a separation of the western part of the United States from that which lies between the Atlantic and the mountains in its whole extent." And so it was the plots of 1800, 1803, and 1807. So Burr actually at many times was working, at different times, was working to get the United States to split, to be destroyed. And that's a letter which confirms it, that actually was written by the ambassador, the British ambassador to the United States in 1804. So here's Aaron Burr. But in 1800, so before the letter we just saw, in 1800, Hamilton actually joined Jefferson against Burr. And he would write why in a letter to Gouverneur Morris on December 24th, 1800. He says, "Jefferson or Burr, the former, without all doubt. Yeah. The latter, in my judgment, has no principle, public or private, could be bound by no agreement, will listen to no monitor but is ambition, and for this purpose will use the worst part of the community as a ladder to permanent power and an instrument to crush the better part. He is bankrupt beyond redemption, except by the resources that grow out of war and disorder, or by a sale to a foreign power, or by great peculation. From the elevation of such a man may heaven preserve the country." So, as you know, Aaron Burr is the one who killed Jefferson in a duel 4 years after. And so Hamilton, sorry. So Hamilton was killed by Aaron Burr in 1804. And I wanted to say, sorry, I just missed. But it was known by Hamilton that Aaron Burr was intriguing and was fomenting dissension, fomenting secession in the United States. Basically, Aaron Burr can be seen as the creator of the origin of Wall Street by killing Hamilton, but also by taking over the banking industry on Wall Street. The Chase Manhattan Bank, that's the origin comes from Aaron Burr. But I wanted to say, okay, well, let's continue. It might come back to me. So Hamilton knew about these intrigues, but so his party at the time, the Federalist Party, was actually being destroyed from the inside, from that side of the Boston crowd, the Brahmins and the others, which were the Anglophiles, but Anglophiles in the sense of the empire. And for Hamilton, he would not go along with this. So for him, it was not a question of just having a party, winning an election, be in power, but for him it was really about principles. So he wrote in 1801, at the beginning of 1801, he wrote in a letter to James Bayard, he said, "If the party shall, by supporting Mr. Burr as president, adopt him for their official chief, I shall be obliged to consider myself an isolated man. It will be impossible for me to reconcile with my notions of honor or policy the continuing to be of a party which, according to my apprehension, will have degraded itself and the country." So at that point, he basically rejected the Federalist Party and really worked to make sure that it would be Jefferson who won the election. And that's what happened. Jefferson won the election. The system at the time worked in a way that basically the one who won the election was to become the president, and the second, the vice president. So Aaron Burr actually became the vice president of Thomas Jefferson. But Hamilton was able on his own to really fight and get the voters in the college, the electoral college, to get the votes for Jefferson instead of Burr, because he understood the real treason faction was the one that Burr was leading, was the advocate for. So that was a very important fight at the time, and now we know what happened. So there's a lot more I feel that could have been said, but for now I thought it would be interesting to have a discussion over this, and I hope that what I forgot from mentioning will come back to me pretty soon. So here it is, and I wanted to give you also some resources if people want to go more in depth. And what I just shown very in a very succinct manner. If you want to know more about before the revolution, the ideas of the revolution, where they came from, and all of this treason faction that Aaron Burr was a representative of. Great work by Anton Chaikin. His older book, Treason in America, and his newer book that was published recently, Who We Are, and all the other books, The Political Economy of the American Revolution, The Miracle in Philadelphia, and In God We Trust, where you can see all of the correspondence, the letters by Jefferson, from Jefferson to Adams, and Adams to Jefferson. Very interesting book with other founders, also correspondences on more of a spiritual subject. Okay, so yeah, that's it for now.
Pascal, thank you so much. That was great. That was a very good resource class. This is great, and I'm going to include a lot of links for those who are here live. I put a few links as Pascal was speaking to some of Jerry's work, an article or an essay that I had written as well, that take different angles at the story Pascal referred to of the three attempts to break up the Union way before the Civil War, led by Burr, in all three occasions. So that was for people who want to dig in more, that'll be there, and that'll be in the description box. Pascal, we got a few questions already lined up for you. I'll throw the first one out to Jerry, and then we got Yuri.
Uh-oh.
Jerry.
Okay, can you hear me, Pascal?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Excellent class. I love that presentation. That was very good in showing Hamilton versus Jefferson. And the one point I wanted to make that I wanted to ask you about was right at the very first. Well, you correctly showed how Jefferson, was well educated, well read, and a lot of people called him the Renaissance man. And that's where I've gotten into big arguments with people about, because Well, he did write that one book, Notes on Virginia, but in my research of Jefferson, I can't find anything he actually wrote. I mean, he wrote a lot of letters
Mhm.
to everybody, especially, you know, the close circle around him. There's a lot. And most of the quotes that people have attributing to Jefferson are quotes taken from these letters that were published later on. And when I look at Hamilton in comparison to that, Hamilton is like the opposite. He's always writing articles for newspapers. In fact, he helped start a newspaper to do it more.
Yeah.
And it just seemed he was more concerned with trying to educate the average citizen through that, whereas Jefferson was not. He was just trying to educate his little inner circle. Even with Hamilton being in the Manumission Society to abolish slavery, I mean, part of the effort they did was to establish schools so that they could educate the free blacks, you know, to help them in society. But did you notice that same thing where I just don't like that Renaissance man thing for Jefferson, because I can't find anything he wrote or he did. It's just all these letters.
He did
Well,
make
that's-
a rocking chair, Jerry. Come on.
Yeah, he's known for a rocking chair and a macaroni machine. This is no joke, but you're right. It was interesting to go back because I gave a presentation on the subject many years ago, and it was very interesting to go back and try to find more material to kind of flush out these different factions, and it's true. It's there's nothing really more from Jefferson than the letters and this one book. He didn't really write much. I mean, he wrote a lot of letters. It's huge. He was writing for hours, everyday letters. But but he was not really a public man, as Hamilton, as you said, was really much more into the education of the population. The Phillis papers, the newspaper that he created to transmit his ideas. The obviously the reports that I mentioned were public too. They were presented to the Congress, but they became, you know, act of Congress, so they were available to people. This was for him was a really a big public debate. It was not just about, you know, having a circle of friends and seeing who could argue the best for one idea or the other, but really shape the nation, shape the future of the United States. So I think you're right. Yeah, there's nothing really more that I could say on that.
All right, Yuri, you had a thought on the Cherokee Confederation, right? Or the
No,
Iroquois,
actually,
Iroquois.
you know, I've read a number of articles on the Iroquois influence on the American system and the design of the American, I want to say democracy, but I know I shouldn't, the American system. And I'd have to reread them to comment intelligently. But I'm wondering if you've done any research on the design of the Iroquois government system. I know that the founders had very complimentary things to say about the skill of the Iroquois and how good they were at rhetoric and speech, and they were largely admired by some of the founders. I can't remember which ones, but I think Ben Franklin and others really had very good things to say about them, and in fact may have based some of the design of the United States. In other words, having a president and two houses, which you don't see that in Europe. You don't see that anywhere, I don't think, except America. That was taken from the Iroquois Confederacy. Do you have any comments? Do you know anything about that? I think it's interesting. There are a number of articles. Most of my web locations for the articles are disappeared, so I can't look them up quickly. I can find them. But anyway, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, it's actually something I've heard before. It's not something I've really researched though, so that it's going to be hard for me to really say anything that's going to elevate your question to.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's fascinating.
It's something I heard before, and
Yeah, take a look at
certainly,
it.
I imagine that Ben Franklin. He was a real he was the Renaissance man of the American Revolution. And I would not be surprised that he was the one who knew the most about this, because he was also quoting Confucius, so he had a very broad understanding of human history and fight for freedom. So that doesn't surprise me, but I'm sorry, I haven't looked into this. There was an article that I wanted to review on the founders and the relationship with the natives, but unfortunately I didn't look it up, so I'm gonna stay quiet on this one. Sorry.
Okay, I want to bring up just one other thing. There's a book called, I believe it's called The Grand Derangement, and this is about the French relationship with the Indians in Canada, and how the British screwed that up. Basically, it seemed to me, I haven't read the book, but I read a couple articles about it. The Grand Arrangement. It's about basically how the Cajuns ended up in Louisiana.
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the Cajuns and the Indians were merging. Apparently, they had a kind of a copacetic interaction with their fur trading and stuff like that. And this was a great irritant to the British. And it ended up in the Grand Arrangement, where they exiled the French to Louisiana, and they became the Cajuns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's some more Indian. To me, it was like, wow, this would have been nice. I mean, when you immigrate to another country, you're supposed to assimilate yourself more or less. And apparently, that was what was going on, and it wasn't liked by some of the powers that be.
That's where I thought you were going with this. The Grand Derangement in French, we call it the same. There's different words actually to say it, but it's the deportation of the Acadians.
That's it.
From where we call it today Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Yeah. So the Isle of St. John at the time it was called by the French settlers. So yes, I mean there's different things which were published. Documentaries also were that I saw not too long ago were also made on that. So yes, the French settlers there had a different dynamics, and obviously the French, the English, and the Spanish when they arrived in America had different ideas of how they were going to deal with the natives. So yes, that's true. I'm not here to say that one was better than the other or whatnot, but obviously when you come in a new place, it upsets the environment in a certain way, and some were better than others, but at dealing with that, but also in the different, for the French, for the English, for the Spanish, whatever, you had good ones and bad ones also inside of them. So yeah, that's a very interesting story to look into. It was around the 1754-56 period that this happened. A lot of Acadians came back, but also went to settle into New France in Quebec City and other places. But yeah, you still have a French speaker in Louisiana because of that.
Yeah.
Quickly,
Well-
I know Jerry has a thought.
Okay.
This question of the Iroquois, Ben Franklin, the founding fathers. Jerry.
Yeah, some of the work I had done on that, Ben Franklin and a friend of his, Cadwallader Colden, basically went up to see the Iroquois and to discuss peace treaty with them. And that's when they did the research on, the government society of the Iroquois. And I think Colden wrote a report on that. And the interesting thing is this is at the same time when Franklin is putting together his Albany Plan of Union, his first proposal for union of the states. So there was a certain influence from the Iroquois nation who were allied with the Americans. The problem they had was the French were sending the Indians from Canada down to attack the American settlements on the frontier to stop them expanding westward. So the only Indian tribes that were allied with the Americans were the Iroquois, and that's why they were friendly towards them and were able to have that kind of discussion. The other point I wanted to make was starting with that, with Franklin and Colden and the Iroquois, every agreement between the natives and the Americans, even the colonies before they were a country, was always a treaty. It was written down in black and white, and everyone signed it. The British never had treaties with the natives. It was sort of a verbal thing, and God knows what was agreed to. But the Americans from day one would enter into written treaties with the natives in terms of where each one stood, and that this was your territory and that was your land. And if an American went on your land and committed a crime, he had to face your justice. Sorry. I mean, that all changed with Andrew Jackson, but there was a certain cooperative agreement between the American colonists and the natives, and with the Iroquois.
Oh, Jerry, yeah, you cut out there at the end, but overall, I think 95% of everything you said was well communicated. Very much appreciated. And if you could share some links, maybe to some of the stuff on Ben Franklin's work from the 1750s and beyond, that would be great as links, which we could share into the group.
It's in my first book, The Approaching Conflict.
Right. I'll make that available.
I'd have to look up exactly which chapter it is, but I did write a little bit on it in there. And I have some books. If you're interested, I have some books I can have you read on that. I can write it down. We can get later.
Send some links. And okay, next up we have Monty, who had a very good question regarding the central bank question. Monty, are you still there? There you are.
Yes, still here. Thank you so much for the most informative presentation. And an argument I run into online, and I'm looking to how most succinctly to address it amongst these neo-Confederate type of circles, the semi-Confederate type of people are arguing on and supporting the abolishment of Jackson of the Second National Bank, and basically what they do is they say it was unconstitutional, the national banks, and also that the national banks were really in effect just private central banks such as the Federal Reserve. Could you kind of succinctly maybe give me a retort to this, how best to effectively at least get inside people's heads? Because I know Jackson is, even Trump, I think, has a picture of Jackson in the Oval Office. I mean, this myth has got to be busted somehow. So could you address that, please?
Yeah, sure. So basically, when Jackson abolished the second bank of the United States, you had the biggest economic crisis ever in the history of the United States, the Great Panic of 1837, because at that point, basically, all the banks could print whatever money they wanted. There was no central organization for that. And that's what Hamilton wanted from the beginning. He didn't want just like to have hundreds of currencies for the United States. He wanted to have one. So that's how they created the dollar with the mint, and having a control over public credit. So investing into something that was not just benefiting one group of people, but would benefit the whole nation. That was the idea: public credit, national banking. So that was for the general welfare, the promotion of the general welfare for now and for posterity. That's what the founding documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution say. So it's constitutional. If you want to keep it short, we could go on for a little bit more, but I think that's the easiest way to go at it.
Yeah, thank you.
Stephen.
First of all, thanks, Pascal, for doing all that research and pulling together a really fascinating lecture. I was going to have a question similar to Monty's, but I think it's a bit different, but it kind of dovetails with it a bit. So I'll do that. The part of your lecture that kind of got me thinking was the issue of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations and those influential American politics who, I guess, embrace that philosophy versus the Hamiltonian system, and that the whole legacy that goes back all the way to Leibniz. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking in particular when I recently learned that Andrew Jackson, and like Monty said, he understood the threat that the private bankers posed. But I was surprised to learn, I believe, that Andrew Jackson actually was of the Adam Smith school of economic philosophy, if I can call it that. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the whole Adam Smith thing and those influential American founders who espouse that versus the Hamiltonian system. I mean, were they just victims of disinformation? Today I would say that from what I've learned through this group, the whole Austrian school versus modern monetary theory is a false dichotomy that places people into either two camps, but steers them away from the American system of political economy. And I was surprised that Andrew Jackson might have fallen into that trap. So I just wonder if you have thoughts of whether or not Adam Smith and there are people who deliberately espouse that to keep people astray, or do certain political leaders mistakenly embrace that and inadvertently get led astray?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I would say there's a lot of willful ignorance into that, but also some evil for sure. When you look at Andrew Jackson, the previous presentation I had done on that subject of Hamilton versus Jefferson, I was going into the Jackson deal too, because it's very important, but I wanted to keep it short for today. But when you look at it, we'll give you more resources to check it out. But really, Jackson was part of the Aaron Burr circles. So he was part of that treasonous faction. And so the idea of the national bank, it was really that was part of this idea of how to make sure that the United States would splinter, would break up. And Andrew Jackson is seen today as a great apostle of the democratic rights and blah blah blah. And that's why also I wanted to say that the United States was not created just to be a democratic entity, a democratic institution. It was created as a republic. So it's very different. And today, people that follow that still revere Jackson, and he's on the $20 bill, so that's good. That's better than a $10 bill Hamilton. Well, that's a trick. That's why I said Hamilton should be on a much higher bill, because he's much more valuable. to the United States and to the world than all of these other guys. And so Jackson was never against private banks. Jefferson neither. When Jefferson actually was president, there was more power over the American nation that was controlled from London. He really, because he didn't want to use Hamilton's system. He kind of had to. And after the War of 1812, they kind of saw that you needed to have a navy, you needed to have a military to provide for the security of the nation, because the British were not gonna let them go so easily. That's very important to know. Well, if people don't know, there was another war with the British in 1812 to 1814 between the United States and the British, where the British burnt Washington, D.C. and wanted to burn, the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. It didn't happen, but they still burned the Capitol. So yeah, these guys, were not. I wouldn't put Jefferson and Jackson in the same category, but for sure, Andrew Jackson was a fake. He was not in any way really pro-American.
Yeah, that's a huge myth that needs to be tackled, and so much can be said on it. I shared a 2012 study by Michael Kirsch, which is available to download as a PDF for anybody who wants to really dig into the messed up reality of what Andrew Jackson was. Mm-hmm. And as part of it, you alluded to it, Pascal, and Jerry goes into it in more detail in his writings. But in terms of the 1807, the third attempt by Burr to break up the Union, using Louisiana that was newly acquired as part, from Napoleon, there's a whole effort there to create sort of a kingdom of Louisiana that would align itself with the British, have a bunch of mercenaries, declare war on Spain, take control of Florida, and then depose the sitting president Jefferson, and install Burr as the new, head of the newly revamped pseudo republic that would then join with British assets in Canada. And the headquarters of this entire plot, which went pretty far, and it would have probably have succeeded had it not been for a patriotic agent who I suppose the plotters believed him to be a member of their conspiracy within the Federalist Party. He went and blew the whistle to Congress and shed light on the reality of this conspiracy before it could unfold properly. And the headquarters of this whole thing was Andrew Jackson's mansion was the base of operations out of which this entire complex thing occurred. And after which Burr, through all of the public hate, and they had congressional hearings on this as well, had such bad publicity. People really rightfully hated him and wanted to lynch him for trying to destroy the Union. Had to escape to Canada with $40,000 given to him by John Jacob Astor, where his nephew, Prevost, I think George Prevost, was Governor General, who then made sure that he would get to meet Bentham, where he stayed at Bentham's house for 5 years in Britain, having the best opium-filled, prostitute-ridden time of his life. And he wrote about that in his diary entries before coming back in 1812, weeks before the war was launched. So, I mean, there's a whole, history is interesting. If they would just teach it this way in school, this would be really something kids could get into. I remember failing history badly because it was just, it's bland. But yeah, I see Susie. Susie has her hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I was responding to Yuri and I was trying to send the message to everybody, but I just sent it to Gerald. But in talking about slaying the Andrew Jackson myth, I guess, maybe a succinct way to put it is that it was America's bank instead of tentacles of the City of London. That bank enabled us to invest in ourselves and our future instead of foreign speculators gambling with our resources.
That's right.
Listening to your all's lectures is like drinking from a fire hose. And sometimes we need a short, sweet, and to the point entrance into the conversation with other people that we're trying to share these ideas with. And so I hope I just gave Yuri one, if I'm correct.
No, that's good. Yeah, it's good to mention it that way, because really, yeah, it was something Hamilton wanted, something that the United States could control. That was not just foreign, holders, other countries, which could determine basically if you could have a road or not. Yeah, you're right. Good.
Yeah, I mean, this class is, I mean, for people who want to dig in a little bit more to some of Hamilton's actual writings, we did just finish a workshop going through over 4 weeks his report on the subject of manufacturers, which gets you into the best sort of principle. Though it's a hard read, but it's like any muscle. You want to work your muscles. You gotta sometimes lift above your capacity a little bit and grow into it, and that's what this exercise was. So we'll make that available too, and people could read along, listen to the discussions from that series of workshops on Hamilton. And his report on the constitutionality of the national bank is also one of these really healthy, interesting reads to get a sense of how is he understanding the nature of a productive credit system and a real national bank versus the type of insanity that was brought in with the Federal Reserve, which has maybe on the surface some mechanical similarities in form, but the substance of it is a totally different universe of intention and design, which confuses a lot of people who have been trained to think very materialistically in our society. We're trained and conditioned to look at the outward appearance of things, and based on pattern similarities, we are told we can draw conclusions, which is the best way to screw up the minds and lie to people. If people think like pattern formation thinking, it doesn't work. Because you'll find like different bad things and different good things often have similar appearances in history. But if you don't look at the immaterial but real causal intentions, the actual principles shaping it, you won't see that they're two very different things. Which is where I guess, again, the question of what the hell was the republic that Jefferson was inspired by, because he saw himself as a Republican. And when you brought up that quote where he's like, I tried to read Plato's Republic, and it's hullabaloo, gibberish. It's like, what the hell kind of idea of a republic did you have then, Jefferson? It's a good paradox. How was he thinking about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and his capacity, for abstraction of these ideals. It's one thing to write letters on whatever you're doing every day, but like to really sit down, and it's hard. It's not something, it's not easy, but to sit down, and obviously it's easier when you have other people to read it with you, but to go through Plato's Republic or any dialogue, that's gonna, it's a good test for your concentration for sure. But it's, as you said, that's the muscle that anybody, and that's what school should be for, to train people to be able to take that in and digest it, because Jefferson is not necessarily wrong. I think that Plato actually wrote a lot of stuff which were not true or not correct. I think that's he didn't just write it for fun. He wrote it for people to actually investigate and come to their own conclusion of why it's not true and it's not correct, and then try to find a solution to the different paradox which he was putting them through in the dialogues. So yeah, there's a real shift. There's a real shift in the Republic, where at the beginning you really have the discussion over justice with Thrasymachus and all the Callicles and all these guys. And then eventually you get to the question of the good, and it's only when you get to the question of the good and how do you promoted, generated, and in the Republic, how the Republic is organized around the good, that's only when it really starts to be interesting. Because all of the talk beforehand in the first 3 or 4 books of the Republic are just trivial in a sense. It's just like the average discussion, but it doesn't really go far to build you anything good. So, you know, that's I think Jefferson missed that switch around.
Yeah. Well, definitely his love of John Locke and that Aristotelian method of the blank slate, assuming that human beings intrinsically have no pre-existent souls, they're just blank slates to be written upon, probably had a lot to do with his inability to recognize the whole method of Plato, which was to try to tickle out ideas by bringing the mind into perplexity and paradox so that the mind could be stimulated to make a discovery and think for oneself, instead of being written on by somebody controlling the definitions and telling you what exactly is the crystallized static definition of justice or a republic or freedom or the good, the way a lot of these, you know, Aristotelians, like Jefferson certainly was, really just craved, like, give me the final answer. Don't make me think for myself. Just give me a formula to, which is, I guess, why he also is so susceptible to Malthus too. That was a great quote too. His actual statement directly saying, oh yeah, Malthus, what a cogent, level-headed way of thinking about organizing society. Of course. And then you read Malthus and you're like, oh my God, killing babies to make space for like new excess eaters. I'd be, Jesus, what a blank spot.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Pascal, thank you so much. I'm assuming, Susie, your hand is still up just from the previous question that you already asked, right?
No, that was a new one, but I think you
Oh.
just went over it.
Oh,
Because what you said about what the hell kind of republic was he thinking about, it's like a republic for just his little clique. And early on, when Pascal was talking about, I don't know, whatever, about his younger years, you could tell that old proverb was coming to mind about bad company corrupts good character, because he just had wrong teachers at a very foundational time. And then I'm not even sure if I can recapture the thought now, but when Pascal did read that quote about him reading Plato, my heart just sunk, because you could hear in that he just was not willing to exercise his mind to think more broadly, more wisely. So I think you just stated that. So I'll put my hand down now and hush. Thank you, Pascal. Thank you. This was wonderful.
Great.
yeah.
My pleasure.
All right. So this sets the stage very nicely. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Quan Le, who is going to go into what actual Platonic Christian humanist Confucian methodology in education should be, how a teacher should be able to think and should be encouraged to think when interfacing with students in an actual healthy society, which is in harmony with natural law and fit to survive morally. So that'll be an interesting exposition. And the type of schooling that if a young Jefferson had only gotten access to, I'm sure he would have avoided the trip falls and intellectual minefield and bombs that he stepped on in the course of his own development, which could have resulted in a much healthier set of conclusions and decisions. So that'll be next Sunday at 2. This coming Wednesday, like always, we're going to keep on with the work by Lyndon LaRouche on economics at the end of a delusion, which is a fun journey. So everyone is invited as always. Thank you, everyone, for taking the Sunday to learn something new. Thank you, Pascal, for sharing.